Hello, I'm Seanan. I'm Russell's co-author on this book. We thought we'd start with a timely event. This is my family, actually. So this is from 2 years ago, but we thought we'd kind of share my experience. So this is the Fong family. You can see here, this is my dad making offerings to my great-grandfather's grave. So basically, a lot of people raise their hands, you celebrate Qing Ming. So what we do is we start by cleaning the grave site, tidying it up, putting flowers in, making the grave nice. Then we have these offerings of food. So here we have the suyok, which is the barbecued pork, as well as cups of wine. So those are the offerings for the ancestors. Oops. Russell, if you can go back.
Yeah, trying to go back. Okay.
So we offer food for the ancestors, and then we do a bye in Mandarin, or in Cantonese it's to buy. So we buy 3 times, and it goes in the order of the oldest or the most senior family member. So it starts with my grandma. So while we wait for Russell to go back there, my grandma, you can see, is standing there. So she goes first, and then it's the eldest son and his family, and then my dad and his families, and then so on and so forth through the children. And then also involved in that is incense. So we light the incense. It's 3 sticks of incense. You offer those, you stick them in the ground. Then you pour out the liquor into the ground. So we don't burn paper money, but that's something I know a lot of people do as well. And then after the ceremony, this barbecued pork we take to we take home, and then everyone shares it. Everyone partakes of the barbecued pork used as the offering, and we share a meal together. And in the next slide, which we were just on, one of the sort of traditions we have is we go to the mall afterwards. So you can see here, this is actually in Canada, in Edmonton. So these are my uncles and my cousin and my sister-in-law, and this is my niece. I'm hearing somebody talking. Is that a question? Okay. So basically this is kind of like a modern tradition. So we go to the mall afterwards and kind of have food there. And it's a chance for the family to spend time together and to have like a mini family reunion. And as you can see here, it's intergenerational. So you can see the different generations being able to partake in the same ceremony and share that experience together. So for us, there's a lot. Something we found in the course of doing the book is that there's a lot of variation with Chinese American families and the kinds of rituals they do. So for us, one of the variations is the date. So this actually all takes place in Edmonton, Alberta, which is very cold. And usually by the normal date of Qing Ming, the ground is still frozen. So as my grandma has gotten older, she's requested us to push back the date. So we kind of have our own family's Qing Ming at a later date. So it's kind of idiosyncratic, but that's after all the snow has melted and it's possible to put stuff into the ground. And then I think there's also some variations on like who we visit. So, we have different ancestors in different graveyards or cemeteries. So you know, I think who people visit or who people can visit is different as well. And actually, one thing I remembered as I was doing this is actually my oldest uncle is a Jehovah's Witness, so he actually doesn't participate in this at all. So it skips to my dad, who's the second oldest brother. Yeah, so it's that's sort of our experience. And you know, as we were doing the book, it was kind of interesting to see how my own family's experience compared to other people's across the U.S.
Yeah, so Shannon's, do you guys see that little red circle? It really bothers me.
Yeah, you can erase it, Russell.
Just for using the eraser?
Yeah.
Oh well.
Huh. Oh, you can press the clear button. Oh, sorry.
So to give you the background about Qing Ming, so it is a festival held today, and it's a day like Memorial Day where we go and honor our those who passed away. In our sample, 8 out of 10 of our second generation respondents said that their immigrant parents continue to practice this tradition. So it's a pretty widespread tradition that people still celebrate in the United States. And the common aim is to provide continuity of ties between the living and their dead ancestors. So in the original practice, you have your po, which is your mortal soul, and that passes away and gets buried at the gravesite. But your immortal soul, the hun, is still around, and oftentimes the hun is still hanging around, living by the gravesite. So the idea is that to take care of your ancestors who are still living, you need to provide for them, and you need to know that they're cared for. Because if they're not cared for and not provided for, then they become wandering ghosts. And then Chinese have to celebrate another holiday to appease the wandering ghost. But overall, it's a practice of going to the gravesite. You have to clean it because it gets weedy and dirty, just to show respect. And then you make the offerings like Shannon talked about. Now, what happens though is that over time, Shannon's family, they do it primarily out of respect. They don't necessarily believe that the ancestor spirits are really there. But some of our respondents do believe still. So Sharon could read this quote from one of our respondents.
So this quote is from Sophia Wong. I think visiting the gravesite is a very respectful thing. Back there, it's the way it is. I guess in a way, to me, it's not just a custom, that it is a belief. It's like something you should do. It's something you're supposed to do. To me, I feel like there is an afterlife. What it is, I don't know. But I think that it creates a stronger family bond.
So for Sophia's family, thanks, Sharon, it's a real belief that the ancestral spirits actually exist. And when you're making your offerings, your ancestral spirits are actually there to receive them. And not only are you caring for them by providing them food and drink and money, but that it's something you should do. There's a moral imperative to doing it. That it has both metaphysical, there's a reality of the spirit world, and it's also a moral responsibility that you should do. So for Sophia, second generation, it's both a moral obligation and a spiritual reality that she deals with. And actually, this picture on the left is the Chinese cemetery that's at Laurel Heights. That used to be at Laurel Heights, where UCSF is now. And you can see them serving or offering the roast pork.
That's where Ruby's house is now, sir.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's the old cemetery.
Okay, Anastasia, here's another.
That's what yours.
Okay, so this is from Julia Tom. She said, we literally offer, we put out fruits and stuff. We placed it out to her, and I guess for the incense, it's almost like offering her my time. I came home and I spent time with her and had a conversation. So it's like our time together. Basically, it does feel like you're giving them something to have in an afterlife so that they have money. You can even go to a store and buy stuff like a car with a driver, a house, and then you can buy sushi. It's like cardboard sushi. There's a whole business because of it, and part of it, it's kind of fun.
So Julia is another believer in Qing Ming and believer in the ancestral spirits. So she actually comes home to the Bay Area from the East Coast purposefully to come and visit her grandmother. And again, she feels like she's really literally offering things to her grandmother. And she has conversations with her grandmother who she feels like is still present with her. And so that's similar to the concept of prayer, where she, again...
Oh, there's a lot of people on.
Again, acknowledges the existence of the spirits and makes offerings to the spirits.
Where do you see that?
Palma, can you mute yourself, please?
Oh, sorry.
So, for ancestor veneration and Qing Ming, you could see it in two ways. If you do a Western religion approach, a lot of Western religion centers around belief. And if you really believe in something, that the spirits really exist, and you're actually offering spirits food and drink and money and cell phones, then it's actually considered a religious practice because you have authentic belief. But if you do it for other reasons, maybe you don't fully believe, like maybe Shannon's family, then it becomes just an ethnic custom, becomes a tradition that you carry on, not necessarily for its, because you believe in it, but you may carry it on because it's your cultural tradition, or you may carry it on because it's a sign of showing respect. So there's a range of ideas behind it, especially if you take a Western perspective. But we're going to argue in our book that this Western way of looking at Qing Ming and ancestral veneration as a religious practice or a custom may not be appropriate. And another comparison is Christmas. Some Christians really believe it's Jesus's birthday, and they celebrate it in that way. A lot of Americans just think it's a holiday, and that's how a lot of Chinese think about Qing Ming. But we'll give you how we think a Chinese understanding of Qing Ming might be.
So yeah, in our book, we develop what we call the theory of Li Yi. So it's basically our attempt to reappropriate a concept from like the Chinese thought landscape to use to understand Chinese Americans on their own terms. So you know, as Russell was saying, there's in the view of religion, you can think of things either as like religious or non-religious. But we think that there's a different way of looking at things. So there's this term Li Yi. So Li means ritual propriety, approximately. So it means things you do to be appropriate or demonstrate ceremony or ritual as appropriate to what you're doing. So it could be anything from a handshake to like a state ritual. Yi approximately means, or it's translated as righteousness, particularly for relationships. So it means, you know, you have the yi of a father or a parent to a child. So that's the obligations that a parent has for their children. Or you have the yi of a child to their parents. So that's the relationship obligations from a parent to a child. So these are all the different relationships you have in life are kind of yi. So Li Yi is a term used together, and it's you know, historically it means it's basically a concept examining how cherished rituals embody values and how deeply held values are lived out. So it looks at both of those. So to go a little bit deeper into like this term historically, So we'll look at each one. So Li. So Li means ritual propriety. As I described, it's ceremony, ritual, anything from the small to the big. And it's used in classical Chinese as opposed to Su, which means customs. So the difference between Li, which is like a ritual, is that it has something to do with your values or your virtues, whereas Su simply has to do with your customs. So it simply is whatever is customary or habitual. So that's the word Li. And then Li is also opposed to Fa and Xing. So Fa means like law, and Xing means like punishment. So in the Confucian worldview, Li, which was ritual propriety, was seen as a way to kind of regulate or govern human behavior, or the behavior of like the people in a place, using sort of non-coercive education and inspiration, whereas Fa and Xing were about like punishment and laws and regulations.
So Li are more internalized ways of responding to people.
And then Yi is righteousness. So again, this is like role, or your proper role with your appropriate relationships and duties. So there's what are known as the 5 cardinal relationships. So that's in traditional Chinese thought. So there's parent, child, siblings, spouses, elders and juniors, and then rulers and subjects. So that originates all the way back to the Li Ji, which is several millennia BCE. And then this is used in classical Chinese as opposed to Jian, which is sort of the idea of being like a trader. So Yi is like being righteous, fulfilling your duties in the role that you're playing. And then Jian is sort of abdicating those duties and not following through with what is right and just.
So Chinese didn't really have a term like religion. And so the matter of belief wasn't as important for Chinese as the matter of doing things the right way, the Li, and doing things for the moral reasoning, the Yi. And so for us to examine Qing Ming, we don't examine it in terms of whether people believe in it or not, but we actually examine it in why do they do it regularly or ritualistically, and what's the meaning behind it. So Sharon, can you read this one?
Mm-hmm. So, meaning of Qing Ming and the rituals of ancestral veneration. My dad did ancestor veneration out of respect. My uncle did it out of belief. For me, it was partially out of respect and a lot of participating in a cultural practice because of communal healing value. Regardless of the metaphysical reality, they have emotional and cultural power. I understand my family more. It was an embodied understanding of what it means to be family.
Thank you. So Chris here acknowledges there was a range of belief in why people did it. Some people do this custom out of respect for the dead. Some people do it out of belief that the dead are still living and are around as spirits. And Chris did it out of a cultural practice, that this is a way for him to maintain his Chineseness, to celebrate his Chinese heritage. And he also recognized that when you do these things, it has an emotional and cultural power. Oftentimes it's really healing for people as they're grieving. And for him, and I think this is what a lot of these Chinese rituals mean, is that he says, I understand my family more. It's an embodied understanding. So all the actions involved, it's not a matter about the belief that is involved, but all the actions involved, the giving of food, the bowing, the pouring out the drink, the sharing of food and eating it together, all those things are an embodied way of what it means to be family. So a lot of our respondents said, our family doesn't express love through words or through hugs, but this is our way of sharing what it means to be family together. And for us, that's the whole point of the book. A lot of the deeply felt rituals that Chinese Americans practice center around the family, and connecting with family, both past and present and the future. So we're going to give you a couple of examples more of how Li Yi, the notion of having good rituals oriented towards good values, operates for Chinese Americans. One is just a really basic ritual, which is having a family meal. And so, Anastasia, can you read this from Aaron?
The Li of Chinese Americans, Rituals of Belonging. Aaron said, we would go there once or twice a month. I feel there was a routine to it. We'd go grocery shopping, then we go to my aunt's. We'd have dinner, visit my cousins, and leave around 9 to 10. I get haircuts almost every time. I never liked the way my aunts cut my hair. She'd do the bowl cut, and I wanted the asymmetric hair. We grew a connection with my cousins and my aunts. That was the reason for the trips, for us to connect with them. Now I don't mind going to see them.
All right, thank you. So Aaron lives in Walnut Creek, and he's like a 20-something-year-old photographer who is sort of still a not fully responsible adult. So his dad still goes to his house. He lives by himself in a condo, but his dad goes to his condo and cleans up for him. But his family in the East Bay drove about 45 minutes to an hour to go to Chinatown every week to have this family dinner and stay a long time. And they do all their chores in Chinatown. He'd get his haircut in Chinatown. And initially he hated it, but over time he realized, no, this family time, these regular meals really are important to him. So now, even though he's sort of this lazily, irresponsible, not employed 20-something-year-old, he still says the most important thing for him is to go to these family dinners, that he'll stop everything just to stay with his family. And a lot of our respondents, Chinese Americans, said they still have regular meals with their family. They go to Saturday dim sum, or they have Sunday night dinners like my family does. And it's often intergenerational. It's often obligatory, but it's also for them a way to connect, and probably one of their most cherished, meaningful acts, that they wouldn't give it up. And now we have Zoom family dinners with shelter in place. The other type of family ritual are going on family vacations or having reunions. And so if you ever go on a cruise, you see a lot of Chinese and Indian families that are, again, extended families going. So Sharon, can you read this one?
Yeah. Li Rituals of Belonging, Family Vacations, Reunions. We have a family reunion for my dad's family for a weekend in the summer. We've been doing that since I've been born. First off, if you don't go, you get a lot of SHIT from the family for the rest of the year. Since we've been going since we were young, it's a tradition, but it's fun and something we do and the cousins like to do. Part of it is that my grandpa is going to die soon. He's 97. It's not like he's crucial because he's napping all the time. It is, for some reason, important that he's around. Jane Man.
So Jane's family is really dysfunctional. She didn't even attend her brother's wedding. She says she has a terrible relationship with her mother because her mother scolded her all the time, and they don't communicate. Despite the hard family relationships and despite the anger and frustration, Jane never misses her family vacation for the summer. She has a big family, and so she said there's 6 households where they have to use an Excel sheet just to track the expenses and to figure out where they're going to go. But again, she doesn't miss it at all, because if she doesn't, she'll get shamed. And now she does it because she likes it, and because primarily it's to be there with her grandfather. And her grandfather isn't doing anything, he's just napping. But again, being present with your family, being connected in that way is really important for Jane. So these family reunions, these family meals, they're not religious rituals, but they're religiously held events that Chinese Americans won't miss, that they think is so important because their family is so important. I'll skip this for now. Another way Chinese conduct rituals are in the little table traditions that they have. that even in our small gestures, our micro ways of being hospitable to each other, those rituals reinforce our family values and reinforce our respect and our love for each other. Okay, Anastasia?
The Li of Chinese Americans, table traditions. There were definitely certain very Asian principles instilled in me. Respecting our elders was emphasized. Respecting authority, too, was something I was taught. Whenever we went to a potluck, we'd salute them as Ayi. We had to answer them. We made sure to go and say hi to aunts and uncles, grandparents. We made sure we had FaceTime and I talked to them. Daniel Liu.
So Daniel, and a lot of Chinese Americans who lived outside Asian areas would have these not family rooms, but rotating potlucks. And so any Chinese family in the region would become part of your extended family, and they would take turns holding potlucks. And in these potlucks, the second generation would learn table traditions. They would learn how to act and interact with their elders with respect, how to interact with each other. And as they had these ritualistic interactions, they learned what it meant to be Chinese. For example, he said the greeting, how you have to greet everybody, and that was really important. A lot of people talked about how whenever they go out, they were taught to serve tea to their grandparents first and to the elders first. And for me and my family, I think my dad was more proud when I served tea to everyone than he cared about my grades. It was a sign of being a good, polite Chinese kid. Other little tiny traditions besides serving tea and besides picking out the best pieces of food even include taking off your shoes before you enter a house, because again, that's a sign of respect, or even where you sit in a car. And so our respondents talked about, oh yeah, of course, the elders sit in the front of the car and the kids would always get in the back. And even when the kids were grown and bigger, they would still sit in the back to honor the grandparents and the elders. So in conclusion, we have a range of Chinese traditions. We have cradle to grave rituals, like we have rituals about birth, rituals of marriage, rituals of funerals. And we also have informal rituals, rituals about family dinners, rituals about family vacations, rituals about how you interact at a dinner table. And all these rituals, a lot of Chinese rituals are centered around how to be family to one another. And that's the highest value that we found held by Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans are actually the ethnic group that is the least religious of any ethnic group in the US in terms of religious affiliation. Over half of Chinese Americans, when asked, what religion do you belong to, will say none. So we're religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. We don't belong to any religion, but we still have a real high value, an ultimate value, and even considered transcendent, where our identity and our sense of belonging don't come from a church, but they come from being part of a family. And our most ethical ways of behaving, our most cherished ways of relating to people aren't, again, based on a scripture or on a religion, but it's around how we be family to one another. So we're going to close here, but we have a lot of data that talks about if you understand Chinese Americans, you don't understand them by asking them what they believe, you understand them by what they do. And what they do is hang around family, go on vacation with family, and treat family as their highest relationship overall. Okay, thanks. We'll open it up to questions now. And if you want to clap, there's a little bar that says reactions, and then you click it, and then you clap for yourself. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
So, if you have a question, either type in the chat function. I don't see the raise hand reaction anymore, Russell. So maybe we can just do it through the chat function.
Yeah, so if you go under your lower bar, you can ask a question by chatting it, or you can unmute yourself and simply ask. Suki?
So one thing that my mom have always insisted is that you either do Qing Ming on the day, which we never do because the crowds are just crazy, or you do it before, but never after. But I noticed that one of the families, I think it was Seanan, who said that his family would do it after, largely because of weather reasons. So have you found that whether, you know, that's a valid thing or just that's something that my mom had always hung on to?
In terms of the date of the event?
Yeah, whether you do it before and you never do it after.
Oh. We had, I don't remember our respondents talking about it. I don't know, we could open it up to the group. Is there a rule about making sure you do it before the date? And if you miss the date, then the ancestors get angry. Part of is about these rituals is that you have to do it the right way. According to whatever I mean, there's variation, but if you're given the way your family does it, you have to do it the right way, and the kids have to follow the way the parents tell them. The problem is that the parents never explain why one way is the right way, but there is an insistence on the right way of doing things. And there's a fear if you don't do it the right way, then maybe the ancestors will be angry, or you're going to shame yourself because you're acting improperly. But does anybody else have a response about the date and having to adhere before Qing Ming and it's bad to do it afterwards?
This is Nancy. I think if you're very traditional, like my mom was, you should do it on or before the date. Otherwise, you know, you're very, she was very superstitious, and that you have to follow the rules, and that you should do it on the day or before the day. Otherwise, it's not good. Yeah, that was her explanation.
But do we know why it's not good?
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, they never give you clear explanations. It's just that it's not good. It's bad luck. Yeah.
Yeah, so just
Hi, this
my,
is Jeannie.
oh,
Oh,
go
hi,
ahead.
this is Jeannie. I remember my mom would say we have to put everything out before noon. And I found by putting out the rice bowls and chopsticks that all the ancestors were right-handed. And their little wine goblet had to be on the right of the chopstick. So it was very, very stylized. Otherwise, it was like not correct in her eye. The other thing that my mother would bring were boiled egg. And before we left the gravesite, well, we'd have lunch. And before we left the gravesite, she would say, crack the eggs and leave the eggshell there. So it's like, I don't know, maybe that's part of the Christian part of her.
Cracking eggs and leaving shells is Christian, or?
It's sort of like, you know, if you stylize it, you think like there's birth and death, and then when you have AIDS, it's like a rebirth. Because
yeah.
shells are there, but the body's no longer there.
Hmm.
But I do know that my family have been Christians for at least 2 generations before me.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple comments from the chat function. Jonathan and Karen both say that there's a general rule that it's like on or before. But that's like their grandmother from Hawaii, Karen says, and Jonathan says just everything in general rule, including birthday, should be on or before and not an afterthought.
Yeah, so just to chime in here, I do remember actually my mom's family, my mom's mom, so my maternal grandmother, was kind of judging my paternal grandmother for doing the Qing Ming, the family Qing Ming after. So yeah, so I think there was like, this is ringing a bell for my family as well. So it's kind of interesting to see the variations here. And I think one of the things to note is that, so this is where like belief kind of contributes to variation. So for my father's family, they're a little bit more secular. So the reasons for doing Qing Ming are not for the spirits necessarily, but really for the family and for carrying out the ritual and for having the experience together and for showing respect and for inculcating those sorts of dispositions and values and virtues. So you know, the date matters less for that. So on my mother's side, there's more of a belief of like, okay, the spirits are actually going to be not taken care of by this time. So the date does become more of a concern. And I think this is also true for like burning money as well. So for my father's side, we've never burned money. Partially, I think because it's not part of that. It's not seen as necessary for the sort of like educational or like virtue aspect of the ritual. But for my mother's family, which is more emphasizing on the actual existence of the ghosts, the burning of the money becomes important because they need that money to be able to have a nice life in the afterlife. So it's a kind of an interesting dimension where the belief does play a role in how these are actually, the mechanics of the ritual are actually carried out.
Yeah, on the chat, people are saying that in Hong Kong and in Hawaii, you have a range of dates, again, for crowd control. So we call this an example of religious change, where the government institutes rules, and then people have more flexibility about when to go. And again, it's for crowd control. You don't want everyone going to the cemetery on this one day. And so you have a range of dates. And so it's sort of interesting how what's considered sacred gets shifted around based on the state or the economy. So, you know, for a lot of like Hindu holidays, they get shifted to a 3-day holiday when it's convenient for everyone to go to the temple.
Hi, I'm Corinne. I'm Brennan's mom. We live in
Hi.
Hawaii, but I grew up in San Francisco, Chinatown in the 60s and 70s. I'm already 4th generation, and so my family did not participate in Qing Ming. However, I do remember buses that would come into Chinatown to pick up people to take them to the cemetery. It was a really confusing thing for me because we were Christian, but even though we didn't participate in this tradition, there were other things that we participated in. And it really resonated me when I heard somebody say that things had to be done the correct way. Setting the table, I always got scolded for putting the chopsticks the wrong way. I got my hands slapped because I held my chopsticks incorrectly. There were a lot of little things, but it was so confusing for me growing up. I'm 65 now because I'm 4th generation. That means Brennan is 5th generation. We were told by my brother and sisters, and I were told by my father that we are always Chinese first, and yet we were expected to be very American. And so hearing all of this is really important to me. Many of my friends who were 3rd generation or 2nd generation lived through this, but my experience was very different, being 4th generation and being told to be American, but you're very Chinese in the home. So that's interesting for me, and I love to hear, really love to hear what other Asian Americans have experienced. Thank you.
Thanks.
A similar question on the chat from Barbara, if there's any regional variations about family observations, if we want to comment on that.
Yeah, I put up that question and I realized it could be read 2 ways. What I meant was regions within the US, but it could also pertain to regions that families trace their heritage back to in China.
Yeah, we got a lot of, we found a big difference based on class background. So if you come from a Cantonese, Toisan type of background, then you are more religious about your Qing Ming practice, and it's more meaningful. And again, doing things the right way is what we call an orthopraxy, as compared to an orthodoxy where you have to believe in the right things. Those who adhere to Chinese popular religion care more about doing things in the right way. And again, most of the Cantonese and Toisanese were more from rural backgrounds, and so they had more of those practices. Other people now immigrating to the US, especially moving to suburbs come from professional backgrounds and are Mandarin speaking. And because they come through professional degree visas or education visas, they tend to be more secular, and they tend to do less of the ritual practice, but still adhere to ancestor veneration, but it's more simplified. It's not about what you do, but it's more about the thinking behind it. And so there are class variations based on your education, and there's regional variations about what's the right way to do it. So the interesting thing is, and there's also being migrants. A lot of times you want to maintain your ethnic practices more conservative. You're more conservative. You sort of try to adhere to your ethnic practices more religiously because you don't want to lose it. Back home, things change, and you're still Chinese, but when you immigrate, like Brennan's mom said, you want to hold on to your Chineseness, and you sort of hold on to the traditions from the past. So a lot of Chinese Americans are holding on to traditions from like the 1940s or the 1920s. You're sort of frozen in time of when your family immigrated, and then you sort of maintain those particular historical practices from that time. And so that's another variation. The other thing about migration that makes a difference is that a lot of Chinese Americans feel like they should be with their parents when they pass away. But if you're in the US and your parents pass away in China or Taiwan or Hong Kong, there's a tremendous guilt. And that's why that movie, The Farewell, was so meaningful and so resonant, right? And so because Chinese feel a lot of guilt and shame, they are actually more religious about ancestor veneration because it's their way of, again, expressing their guilt and remorse for not being present with their parents.
Russell, there were a few questions about the paper offerings.
Oh yeah, I saw that
in the chat. One of them was about the if there's a more environmental or a friendly way of the practice, and then Jonathan asked if there's any surveys or studies about the paper offering industry, and he said adding the iPhone to the catalog.
Yeah, I like these questions. Thanks, Shannon. I don't know the answer, so. But here's a picture of someone buying the paper phone for their ancestors, and the iPhones are really popular.
Yeah, I don't know the details either, but I'm pretty sure these are like vendors that are just coming up with like I think the tradition of like just having material things or representations of material things on paper goes back a long time. So like having iPhones or whatever is it's just an extension of that. It's not really an innovation. Like you have your iPhone when you're alive and you have it on your bed.
I was trying to look it up last night about all the paper goods you can buy, and if anybody's done a study of the industry. I'm sure they've done it, but I couldn't find anything. But it's, you're going to get a paper Lexus. You're not going to get your grandparents a paper, I don't know what's a bad car these days.
I really like these questions, or I'm looking at this chat box. I'm really liking the questions about like, what is the proper, like, are there any guides for how to do the proper thing? And it's really interesting because, yeah, to my knowledge, there aren't, but I'm kind of interested too. Like growing up, I felt a little bit alienated from the proper way of doing things and why you did things. And, like other families that we interviewed or other second generation Chinese Americans that we interviewed, I grew up not really knowing why we were doing the things. So like, you would go to the gravesite, you would bow, and you'd be thinking like, am I doing this right? Like, why am I doing this? This is kind of embarrassing. Like, mom, am I doing this right? And I think that's a big gap that a lot of our interviewees also had. So I've kind of been curious about like putting together like a guide or something So that kind of represents or captures what like the movements mean, or like, you know, there's this question about like, oh, like the placement of the food. So that reminds me that, so while we were kind of researching the historical pieces of this book, one of the things I found really interesting was the attempts in the Song dynasty, so like the 900s to 1100s, to codify these family rituals by Confucian scholars. So there's this book, or this booklet called Family Rituals by Zhu Xi, who is a very famous Neo-Confucian scholar. And he tried to observe all these cultural practices. So in the 900s as well, people had all sorts of variations on these cultural practices around Qing Ming and New Year's and coming of age rituals and funerals, and they would be, you know, varied. But Zhu Xi tried to say, hey, what are the reasons people are doing this, and how can we restore restore it to like good reasons to do it, like not because we're superstitious or afraid of the spirits or ghosts, but because we want to inculcate or develop or cultivate in ourselves certain dispositions and values of respect and reverence. So, you know, this kind of like alienation from the rituals is like very old. So like we're part of a tradition and being kind of part of that. And there's always been debate or questions around like what everything means. And we can all be part of defining what that means and being part of making that ritual alive for us.
Thanks. A lot of people ask, so what's the role of family associations in Qing Ming and ancestor veneration? And why do they offer up offerings sort of in proxy for others? Sean, do you have any response of why the family associations would do it, and whether the second generation help or work with the family associations in these activities?
The family, so from what I remember from like looking into like the Chinatown, you're talking about like the Chinatown like Tongs, right? Like the Wong family benevolent
Yeah.
and stuff. I think those were, the family associations would kind of spearhead those because they would be the like organizational institutional center for you know, Chinese immigrant families. So it was really more for like Chinatowns. And then they would kind of provide that like continuity and the community to do it with, and the institutional like strength. But I also think that a lot of people have different immigration stories, like to the suburbs or where family associations were not strong, or more recently when family associations have not been that active, or less active in the lives of people. Families have more like gone it alone, I think, without that backbone.
But is part of the reason why the family associations do it is in case you can't do it, is so that, again, to take care of the family ancestors in general, so that they don't become ghosts. So if if we have any negligent people in our association, we could, by proxy, support the ancestors in our family association. Is that, you think, the thinking?
I'm not totally sure about the internal mechanics of that, but that sound. So I do know that, like, I'm aware of like people, like proxying offerings for other family members, even though it's not the direct line. So I can imagine that being also happening in the family associations.
I know one thing the family association do is they effectively offer up kind of a substitute for ancestors whose graves are not here in the U.S. So 3 out of 4 of my grandparents are in China. Their graves are in China. So you could set up kind of an altar at the family association, and then what you can do is you can pay respects there, as a proxy for the actual grave elsewhere.
Yeah, again, one of the primary roles of family associations, especially in the 19th century, early 20th century, is to send the bones back so that they would get proper burials and so that they would get proper offerings. Hey, Kelwin's son. Okay, yeah, so for later generations, how do we learn about these traditions, and are these traditions getting continued? And that's a whole chapter of our book. And again, a lot of these traditions, the right ways of doing things are getting lost because parents don't necessarily explain why they do things, but they just model it for the kids, and then the kids have no understanding of why they're doing it. And so the kids either make up their own ways of doing things, or they Google it, and they create their own meanings out of them. And another reason why these traditions get lost is what Thomas has said, is that Chinese popular practices are considered superstitious and foreign, and they could get made fun of it. And especially in this particular context, Asian kids don't want to appear foreign or different, and so they don't pay attention to the Chinese aspects of their background. And it's you know, it's easier to become more Americanized if there's a distinction between those two. So both the racism and the lack of explicit training, and also the lack of institutions. So a lot of kids don't belong to these family associations that would explain to them why they're doing things. They all lead to religious change. We're not saying it's necessarily assimilation or acculturation, because again, they are still adhering to the meaning of family. Chinese Americans value family a lot more than every ethnic group values family, but Chinese Americans value family in a different way. And also, like, if you look at polls, Chinese Americans, this is really interesting to me. What's the most important thing in your life? Is it falling in love and having a good marriage? Is it buying a house? Is it having a career? Chinese Americans say the top goal in their life is to be a good parent. Isn't that interesting? These are 20s and 30-year-olds. When I was 20, I never thought about getting married or having kids. But even young people say being a good parent is their top goal in life. And that just shows their orientation to adopting a role and a responsibility of receiving what you've been given and carrying it on to the future. So I think Chinese Americans do maintain those Chinese values, and they maintain Chinese ways of relating, but how it gets expressed ritually is really different. Instead of the right way of doing ancestor worship, it becomes, how do we do a cruise well, or how do we celebrate Lunar New Year in a new way? So I think what happens, again, it's not necessarily assimilation, but I think Chinese Americans hybridize and make sense of their lives, combining their transnational Chinese background with their very American ways of making meaning and having fun too. So what gets maintained in the US is what's fun. So for Chinese New Year's, it's giving the red envelopes because that's fun. And besides fun is what's food oriented. And so Chinese will carry on food traditions a lot more. Food traditions will probably last a lot longer after everything. So we'll be eating roast pork for the rest of our lives, for generations, but they'll never know why they're eating roast pork.
Russell, what do you think of this? Like, so rejecting old traditions on account of them being foreign, are they, by positioning themselves against these practices, fighting against Orientalist tropes, or are they acting adjacent to American hegemony? So like, part of it is like, you know, by rejecting it, are you being like, oh, I'm rejecting like how people are racializing me and reducing me just to like exotic customs, or are they then like becoming subjects, I guess, of like American like totalizing hegemony?
Yeah, and again,
on that.
What I'm arguing is that they're hybridizing, that they're maintaining values, which is the key thing, right?
Yeah.
But they're creating new rituals to express those values of family. And that's why I talked about family reunions done in a certain way, and family vacations done in a certain way. So yeah, it's a hybridization process. Yeah, rather than a either or. Do you guys get what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question.
No, thanks. Thanks, Jonathan. So again, our book, Family Sacrifices, is a little bit about those Chinese traditions, a lot about Lunar New Year, a lot about red egg and ginger parties, a lot about tea ceremonies at a wedding, a lot about the death ceremonies. But it's also about how we, how religions change through migration, and how these popular religious practices get rearranged and understood differently by Chinese Americans. And there's different factors that lead to, like Brennan's mom said, over generation, people continue their Chineseness, but the meaning and their understanding and how they maintain their Chineseness changes over time. So that's the point of the book. And it's a new theoretical framework of how to understand religion outside of a Western perspective.